The schoolhouse bell tolled 7 times across the October morning, its bronze voice echoing off the birch trees that pressed close against the building's weathered clapboard walls. Margaret Thorne stood at the threshold, her worn leather satchel heavy with lesson plans and the weight of 23 years teaching children in this corner of Vermont where the mountains kept their secrets and the lake never quite thawed, even in summer. She had always been different, and the children sensed it immediately. Not the obvious differences that marked other spinster teachers, the slight tremor in her left hand when she wrote on the blackboard, or the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence as if hearing voices from empty air. Margaret's difference lay deeper, in the way she could see the spaces between things, the gaps where others saw only solid certainty. "Good morning, class," she said, stepping inside as 32 young faces turned toward her. The morning light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes and the faint chalk residue that seemed permanently suspended in the air of every schoolroom she had known. Sheriff Coleman Hartwick occupied the back corner, his bulk folded awkwardly into a child-sized chair. His presence filled the room like smoke, suffocating and unavoidable. The badge on his chest caught the light as he shifted, metal against wool, a small sound that somehow commanded more attention than the scrape of 30 pencils. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never been contradicted in this town, "I trust you have the attendance records ready for review." Margaret's fingers found the familiar weight of the leather-bound attendance book, its pages filled with careful notations in her precise script. She had maintained these records with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. Each name entered with deliberate attention to spelling, each absence noted with the date and, when possible, the reason. "Of course, Sheriff." She opened the book to the current week's entries, her eyes scanning the familiar names. Tommy Brennan, Sarah Mitchell, the Henderson twins, little Amy Carpenter with her perpetually ink-stained fingers, all present and accounted for. Hartwick stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that made several children flinch. He approached her desk with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and heavy. Margaret noticed the way the children's attention shifted, how their small bodies turned toward the sound of his approach like flowers following the sun. "The state requires accurate records," he said, extending one large hand toward her book. "No exceptions, no irregularities. Children who attend this school must exist in the eyes of the law." Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening on the binding. Something in his tone suggested this was more than a routine inspection. She glanced toward the blackboard where she had written the morning's assignments in her careful script, noting absently that the chalk dust seemed to shimmer in the light. "Is there a problem with my records, Sheriff?" "That remains to be determined." He took the book from her hands, his fingers brushing hers briefly. His skin was cold, she noticed, cold as lake water in November. "The state has received certain inquiries about enrollment discrepancies." The children had gone silent now, 32 pairs of eyes watching this adult exchange with the peculiar intensity that children brought to moments when they sensed danger but could not yet name its source. Margaret felt their attention like a physical weight, pressing against her shoulders and the back of her neck. Hartwick opened the attendance book, his thick fingers turning pages with surprising delicacy. Margaret watched his face as he read, noting the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set as he reached the current week's entries. "These names," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "David Chen, Emma Kowalski, Michael Santos." He looked up at her, his pale blue eyes holding a hardness she had not seen before. "Show me these children." Margaret's heart began to beat faster, a rhythm she could feel in her throat and wrists. She glanced toward the classroom, her eyes moving across the familiar faces. Tommy Brennan in the 3rd row, his freckled face turned toward them with unconcealed curiosity. Sarah Mitchell near the window, her blonde braids catching the morning light. The Henderson twins sharing a desk, despite her repeated attempts to separate them. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. "Simple enough question." Hartwick's voice carried a new edge, sharp as winter wind. "David Chen, where is he sitting?" Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She looked again at the children, counting faces, matching them to names in her memory. 32 children, 32 names in her attendance book. But as she tried to place David Chen among the familiar faces, she found only empty space where his presence should be. "Third row," she said, her voice steady despite the growing uncertainty. "Next to the window." Hartwick followed her gaze to where Tommy Brennan sat alone at a desk meant for two, his geography book open to a map of New England. The sheriff's expression shifted, becoming something between confusion and suspicion. "I see only the Brennan boy." Margaret stared at the empty space beside Tommy. She could remember David Chen clearly. Dark hair that fell across his forehead, serious brown eyes, a quiet child who excelled at arithmetic but struggled with reading. She could remember calling his name just minutes ago, could remember his soft present in response. "Emma Kowalski," Hartwick continued, his voice growing harder. "Michael Santos, show me where they sit." The classroom felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing inward as Margaret's eyes moved from desk to desk. She could remember each child clearly, could recall their faces and voices and the particular ways they held their pencils or raised their hands to ask questions. But as she looked now at the assembled students, she saw only familiar faces, children whose names she had known for weeks or months or years. "There seems to be some confusion," she said, her teacher's voice steady and professional despite the hammering of her heart. "No confusion." Hartwick closed the attendance book with a sharp snap that echoed through the room. "These names exist in your records. These children do not exist in this classroom. That constitutes a serious irregularity." The word hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Margaret felt the children's attention sharpen, their young minds beginning to grasp that something was wrong, that the familiar rhythm of the school day had been disrupted by forces beyond their understanding. "Perhaps if you could give me a moment to review my notes." "No." Hartwick's voice cut across hers with the finality of a courthouse gavel. "These records will be submitted to the State Education Department for investigation. Until this matter is resolved, you will maintain only accurate attendance for children who can be physically verified." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar flush of shame that had marked so many moments in her life when her difference became visible to others. She had learned long ago to hide the things she saw that others could not, the spaces between solid objects where light seemed to bend and shift. She had built her career on careful attention to detail, on being more thorough and precise than anyone could question. "I assure you, Sheriff, my records have always been accurate." "Then you won't mind explaining to the parents of David Chen, Emma Kowalski, and Michael Santos why their children appear in your attendance book, when, according to school district records, no such children have ever been enrolled." The words hit Margaret like cold water. She gripped the edge of her desk, feeling the solid wood beneath her palms as the room seemed to tilt slightly around her. The children watched in fascination and growing alarm as their teacher's composed facade began to crack. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it?" Hartwick stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and the wool of his heavy coat. "Or is it possible that you've been maintaining fictional records? Creating imaginary students for reasons the state would very much like to understand?" Margaret's mind raced, searching for an explanation that would make sense to this man, whose world contained only what could be measured and documented. She thought of David Chen's careful handwriting, of Emma Kowalski's habit of humming softly while she worked, of Michael Santos's infectious laugh during recess. These children were as real to her as any others, as solid and present as Tommy Brennan or Sarah Mitchell. "I need to check my enrollment files," she said, grasping for time and space to think. "You need to understand something very clearly." Hartwick leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. "This community has rules, simple rules. Children who attend school exist. Teachers who work in this district maintain accurate records. People who cannot follow these basic requirements find themselves unemployed and unwelcome." The threat settled over the classroom like frost, visible in the way the children shrank back in their seats and the way Margaret's hands began to tremble slightly. She had worked too hard and too long to build her place in this community, had endured too many whispered comments about the spinster teacher with her odd ways and her solitary life by the lake. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good." Hartwick straightened, tucking the attendance book under his arm. "I'll return this tomorrow, after it's been properly reviewed. Until then, teach only the children you can see." He moved toward the door with the same measured pace, each step deliberate and heavy. As he reached the threshold, he paused and turned back to face the classroom. "Children," he said, his voice assuming the false warmth adults used when addressing young people they did not particularly like. "Remember that truth is important. Always tell the truth about what you see and what you know. Your teacher is counting on you to be honest." The warning was clear enough, though delivered in language the younger children might not fully grasp. Margaret watched as several of the older students exchanged glances, their faces showing the particular alertness that came when adults began speaking in codes. After Hartwick left, the classroom fell into an uneasy quiet. Margaret stood at her desk, feeling exposed and vulnerable without the familiar weight of her attendance book. She could sense questions forming in the children's minds, could see the way they looked at her with new uncertainty. "Well then," she said, summoning her teaching voice from some reserve of professional composure. "Let's begin with arithmetic." But as she turned toward the blackboard, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. There, written in chalk dust that seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light, were 3 names that had not been there moments before: David Chen, Emma Kowalski, Michael Santos. The chalk seemed to pulse with its own faint luminescence, visible only when she looked at it indirectly. Margaret glanced quickly at the children, but their attention was focused on their arithmetic books, small faces bent over columns of numbers. She reached for the eraser, her hand moving toward David Chen's name. But as her fingers approached the board, she felt a resistance, as though the air itself had thickened around the chalk marks. The sensation sent a chill down her spine, a cold that seemed to seep into her bones. From somewhere in the back of the classroom came a soft whisper, barely audible above the rustle of turning pages. "Don't erase us." Margaret spun around, her eyes scanning the rows of bent heads. None of the children had looked up. None showed any sign of having spoken, but the words hung in the air like incense, heavy with meaning and desperation. She turned back to the board, staring at the 3 names that shimmered like heat mirages in the chalk dust. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that Sheriff Hartwick's investigation was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple clerical error. Whatever was happening in her classroom, whatever force had written those names in chalk dust that glowed with its own light, it was real. And it needed her help. The morning after Sheriff Hartwick's visit, Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse to find the official notice nailed to the front door. The paper fluttered in the October wind like a trapped moth, its state seal gleaming dully in the grey light. Her hands shook as she read the formal language that reduced her 23 years of teaching to a series of bureaucratic concerns requiring immediate remediation. Effective immediately, all attendance records for Miss Margaret Thorne's classroom will be subject to daily verification by appointed officials. Any discrepancies between recorded attendance and physical presence of students will result in suspension of teaching privileges pending full investigation. The words blurred as she read them again, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Behind her, she could hear the approaching voices of children walking to school, their morning chatter a familiar comfort that now felt fragile and temporary. Tommy Brennan reached the schoolhouse first, his cheeks red from the cold and his wool coat buttoned crookedly. He stopped short when he saw Margaret standing motionless before the door, the official notice still clutched in her gloved hands. "Miss Thorne, are we in trouble?" The simple question pierced through her paralysis. She folded the notice quickly and slipped it into her coat pocket, then turned to face Tommy with what she hoped passed for a reassuring smile. "Not at all, Tommy. Just some paperwork from the state. Nothing for you to worry about." But as more children arrived and gathered around the schoolhouse steps, Margaret could see in their faces that they remembered yesterday's tension, the way Sheriff Hartwick's presence had changed the very air in their classroom. They clustered together with the instinctive wariness of young animals sensing a predator nearby. She unlocked the door and led them inside, going through the familiar morning routines with mechanical precision. Coats hung on pegs, lunch pails placed on the shelf by the window, books retrieved from desks. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of the school day, Margaret felt a current of electricity that made her skin prickle with awareness. The blackboard had been cleaned sometime during the night. Not a trace remained of the 3 names that had appeared in shimmering chalk dust, as though they had never existed at all. Margaret stared at the blank surface, remembering the whispered plea that had seemed to come from empty air. "Don't erase us." At exactly 8 o'clock, the schoolhouse door opened again. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the figure in the doorway. Not Sheriff Hartwick this time, but his deputy, a thin man named Clement Rourke, whose pale eyes missed nothing and whose presence in any room felt like winter settling in to stay. "Miss Thorne." Rourke's voice carried no warmth, only the flat efficiency of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "I'm here for the daily verification." The children fell silent, their morning conversations dying as Rourke's gaze swept across the classroom. Margaret watched him count heads with mechanical precision, his lips moving silently as he tallied rows and assigned numbers to faces. 32 students present," he announced, pulling a small notebook from his coat pocket. "Please provide your attendance record for verification." Margaret's stomach clenched. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her enrollment files, searching for any documentation of David Chen, Emma Kowalski, and Michael Santos. The files contained no record of their enrollment, no emergency contact information, no previous school transcripts. Yet she could remember each child with perfect clarity. David's struggle with consonant clusters, Emma's talent for drawing birds in the margins of her compositions, Michael's habit of tapping complex rhythms on his desktop during mathematics lessons. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion with my record keeping," she said carefully. "I'm in the process of reconciling the enrollment files with attendance data." Rourke's pale eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "Confusion is not acceptable. The state requires accurate daily attendance. If you cannot provide accurate records, perhaps someone else should be teaching these children." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt the familiar flush of shame rising in her cheeks, the heat that always accompanied moments when her difference became a liability. She had spent years learning to hide the things she saw that others could not, to translate her peculiar perceptions into language that would not mark her as different or dangerous. "Of course. I'll have corrected records by tomorrow morning. See that you do." Rourke closed his notebook with a sharp snap. But instead of leaving, he moved deeper into the classroom, his pale eyes scanning the walls and windows with the thoroughness of a man searching for contraband. "Children," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense quiet. "Has anyone seen students in this classroom who are not here today? Any children your teacher may have counted as present when they were actually absent?" Margaret's blood chilled. The question was clearly designed to trap her, to catch her in whatever deception Hartwick and his people believed she was perpetrating. She watched the children's faces, seeing confusion and fear in equal measure. Sarah Mitchell raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, I don't understand the question." "Simple enough. Have you seen children in this room who aren't here now?" The children exchanged glances, their young faces showing the particular wariness that came when adults began asking questions that felt like tests with unknown stakes. Margaret held her breath, waiting for someone to mention David or Emma or Michael. Instead, Tommy Brennan spoke up with the blunt honesty of childhood. "We see the children who are here, sir." Same as always. Rourke's mouth tightened with frustration. "What about names on the blackboard? Has your teacher written names of children who weren't in class?" Margaret felt sweat gathering between her shoulder blades despite the morning chill. The question was too specific, too pointed. Someone had been watching her classroom more closely than she had realized. "Miss Thorne writes our assignments on the board," said Amy Carpenter, her voice barely above a whisper. and sometimes the date and spelling words. Nothing else? No names of absent students? The children shook their heads in unison, their faces showing genuine bewilderment. Margaret realized with a mixture of relief and growing unease that they truly could not see what she saw, could not remember the names that appeared and disappeared in chalk dust that glowed with its own light. Rourke spent another 10 minutes prowling through the classroom, examining desks and peering at the blackboard from various angles. Margaret watched him with growing nervousness, wondering what signs of her supposed deception he might be searching for. Finally, he returned to the front of the room, his pale eyes fixing on Margaret with unmistakable menace. "You understand, Miss Thorne, that falsifying attendance records is a serious offense. Not just grounds for dismissal, but potentially criminal fraud against the state." "I understand. Good. Because there are people in this community who believe you've been creative with your record keeping. People who think a teacher with your particular reputation might be inclined toward fantasy over fact." The words hit Margaret like a slap. Her particular reputation, the whispered comments about the spinster teacher who lived alone by the lake, who sometimes paused in the middle of lessons as though listening to voices only she could hear, who had never married, despite her decent looks and respectable position. "My records have always been accurate," she said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Have they?" Rourke stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his thinning hair. "Because I've been asking questions around town. Visiting parents, checking birth certificates. And you know what I've discovered?" Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She could sense the children's attention focused on this adult confrontation, could feel their growing anxiety as they witnessed their teacher being challenged and threatened. "No family in this town has ever heard of David Chen, Emma Kowalski, or Michael Santos. No birth records, no baptismal certificates, no family histories. These children, Miss Thorne, do not exist." The words echoed through the classroom like gunshots. Margaret felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting around her, the way solid certainties could suddenly become fluid and unreliable. She gripped her desk for support, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Is it? Or is it possible that you've been seeing things that aren't there? Writing down names of children who exist only in your imagination?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret could feel the children's stares, could sense their confusion and growing fear as they watched their teacher accused of madness or fraud. She had worked too hard to build her reputation, had struggled too long against the whispered doubts about the unmarried woman with her odd ways. But as Rourke waited for her response, Margaret became aware of something else in the classroom. A presence that seemed to hover at the edges of her vision, just beyond the range of normal sight. She could feel eyes watching her, could sense the desperate attention of beings who existed in the spaces between solid certainties. "Don't let them erase us," came a whisper so faint it might have been her imagination. "Please." Margaret straightened, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. "I maintain accurate records, Deputy Rourke. If there are discrepancies, they will be resolved through proper channels." Rourke's face darkened with frustration. He had clearly expected her to crumble under his accusations, to confess to whatever deception he believed she was perpetrating. Instead, he found himself facing a schoolteacher who refused to be intimidated despite the growing evidence that her career and reputation hung by the thinnest of threads. "Very well, but understand this. You're being watched every day, every lesson, every mark you make in those attendance books. One more irregularity, one more name that doesn't match a face, and you'll be out of this job faster than snow melts in spring." He moved toward the door with angry, jerky steps. But as he reached the threshold, he turned back one final time. "And Miss Thorne, next time I come here, I'll be bringing parents with me. Parents who want to know why their tax dollars are paying for a teacher who can't tell the difference between real children and imaginary ones." The door slammed behind him with a sound like thunder, leaving the classroom in stunned silence. Margaret stood at her desk, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the weight of 32 pairs of young eyes. She could see questions forming in their minds, could sense their loyalty to her warring with their growing confusion about what was happening in their familiar world. Tommy Brennan raised his hand tentatively. "Miss Thorne, are you in trouble because of us?" The question broke her heart. These children, with their runny noses and ink-stained fingers, their eager faces and boundless capacity for wonder, they were real and solid and present. But somewhere in the spaces between their desks, in the gaps between what could be seen and what could be documented, other children waited for her to acknowledge their existence. "No, Tommy, you're not the problem." But as she turned toward the blackboard to begin the day's lessons, Margaret saw them again. 3 names written in chalk dust that seemed to glow with its own desperate light. David Chen, Emma Kowalski, Michael Santos. The letters pulsed like heartbeats, visible only when she looked at them sideways, existing only in the peripheral vision of her peculiar sight. She reached for the eraser, then stopped. Somewhere in the classroom, she could swear she heard the faint sound of children breathing, the soft rustle of small bodies shifting in chairs that appeared empty to everyone else. "Miss Thorne." Sarah Mitchell's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Margaret realized she had been standing frozen for several long moments, staring at names that only she could see. She forced herself to turn away from the board, to face the children who looked at her with growing concern. "Of course, dear. Let's begin with reading, shall we?" But as she opened her lesson book, Margaret knew that her careful, ordered world was dissolving around her. The children she could see were real. The children she could not see were equally real. And somehow, she was caught between 2 versions of reality that could not coexist in the same space. The only question was whether she would choose the safety of accepted truth or the dangerous territory of what she knew to be real. Either choice would cost her everything she had worked to build. But only one would allow her to live with herself. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Silent Lake, and Margaret could feel the first electric touches of lightning in the air. Margaret stood in the empty schoolhouse as the afternoon light slanted through dust-heavy windows, casting long shadows across desks still warm from young bodies. The silence felt different now. Not the peaceful quiet of a day's work completed, but the charged stillness that preceded storms. In her hands, she held a leather-bound journal she had not opened in 15 years, its pages filled with observations she had sworn never to speak aloud. The journal contained her real records, not the sanitized attendance logs required by the state, but careful documentation of everything she truly saw in her classroom. Children who flickered in and out of visibility like candlelight in wind. Names that appeared on her blackboard in handwriting that was not her own. Voices that whispered homework answers from empty desks. She had begun keeping these secret notes during her 3rd year of teaching, when the weight of hiding her difference had become almost unbearable. The journal was her safety valve, the one place where she could acknowledge what her eyes showed her without fear of judgment or dismissal. Now, as she turned its yellowed pages, she felt like an archaeologist uncovering evidence of her own madness. "October 15th, 1952, she read in her careful script. "Jenny Morrison present in morning, absent by afternoon. Parents claim no knowledge of child. Birth certificate shows stillborn infant." The entry was followed by dozens of similar notations spanning more than a decade. Children who existed only in the spaces between official documentation and living memory. A soft knock at the schoolhouse door interrupted her reading. Margaret quickly closed the journal, her heart hammering as she called out, "Come in." To her surprise, the visitor was not Deputy Rourke or Sheriff Hartwick, but Eleanor Brennan, Tommy's mother. Eleanor was one of the few women in town who had ever treated Margaret with genuine warmth, perhaps recognizing in the unmarried schoolteacher a kindred spirit of sorts. Both women who had learned to navigate a world that had little patience for those who did not fit neatly into expected categories. "Miss Thorne," Eleanor said, her voice carrying an unusual tension. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." "Please, sit down." Margaret gestured toward one of the adult-sized chairs kept for parent conferences. "Is everything all right with Tommy?" Eleanor perched on the edge of the chair, her weathered hands twisting the fabric of her wool skirt. She was a handsome woman despite the hard lines that years of farm work had etched around her eyes and mouth. But today, she looked older, worn down by some invisible weight. "Tommy's been having dreams," she said finally. "Strange dreams about children in his classroom. Children he can describe in perfect detail but can't quite remember when he wakes up." Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach. "What kind of dreams?" "He talks about a boy who sits next to him, helps him with arithmetic. A Chinese boy, he says, though we've never had Chinese families in this town, and a girl with yellow braids who draws pictures of birds. Another boy who hums while he works." Eleanor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He describes them like they're his friends, Miss Thorne. Like he's known them for months." The descriptions matched perfectly with Margaret's memories of David Chen, Emma Kowalski, and Michael Santos. But if Tommy could remember them, even in dreams, perhaps the barrier between the visible and invisible world was not as absolute as she had feared. "Children have vivid imaginations," Margaret said carefully. "Do they?" Eleanor's eyes searched Margaret's face with uncomfortable intensity. "Because I've been having dreams too. Dreams about children I never had, babies who died before they could draw breath. And when I wake up, I can remember their faces clear as day." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither woman was certain they should cross. Margaret felt the weight of her secret journal in her hands, its pages full of evidence that she was not the only one who had glimpsed the children who existed in the spaces between life and death. "Eleanor," she said slowly, "what exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you see them too. The children who are there but not there. The ones Sheriff Hartwick claims don't exist." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice urgent with desperation. "Because if I'm going mad, I need to know, and if I'm not, then something is happening in this town that goes deeper than attendance records and state investigations." Margaret stared at the other woman, weighing the risks of honesty against the crushing isolation of carrying her secret alone. For 15 years, she had hidden her gift behind careful professionalism and strategic silence. But now, faced with evidence that others shared her peculiar sight, she felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. "What would you say," she asked quietly, "if I told you that some children exist in ways that cannot be documented? That birth and death are not as absolute as we pretend them to be?" Eleanor's breath caught. "I would say that explains why my younger sister still visits me in dreams, even though she died of scarlet fever when she was 6. And why I sometimes find toys in my house that don't belong to Tommy. Toys that disappear when I try to put them away." The admission opened something between them, a recognition of shared experience that neither woman had expected to find. Margaret felt the familiar sensation of the world shifting around her, revealing depths and complexities that most people never suspected. "The children in my attendance records," she said carefully, "are as real as Tommy or Sarah Mitchell. They simply exist in a different way." "What kind of different way?" Margaret opened her journal again, turning to entries she had never shared with another living soul. Children who died before they could complete their education. Children who were stillborn but whose spirits remained curious about the world they never got to experience. Children who exist in the spaces between what is officially recorded and what actually happens. Eleanor's face went pale. "Dear God, how many? In 15 years? Dozens. They come and go like seasons, some staying for weeks, others appearing only once or twice before moving on to whatever comes next. And you've kept records of all of them?" "I've tried." "Someone should remember them, should acknowledge that they existed even if they couldn't be officially documented." Margaret's voice carried a weight of grief that surprised her. They hunger for education, for the experience of childhood they were denied. What harm is there in letting them learn? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what she had heard. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the schoolhouse windows and sending leaves skittering across the wooden steps. "Sheriff Hartwick doesn't see them," Eleanor said finally. "No. Most people can't. It's a particular kind of sight, like being able to see certain colors that others are blind to." Margaret hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "I've always been different in that way. Even as a child, I saw things that others couldn't. And now, they're threatening to destroy you for it." The words struck home with brutal accuracy. Margaret nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I can't prove the children exist. I can't produce birth certificates or enrollment forms. All I have is my word, and my word has never been enough in a world that values only what can be measured and documented." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she stared out at the darkening sky. "There has to be a way. Some kind of proof that even Hartwick couldn't dismiss." "What kind of proof? How do you document a ghost? How do you provide evidence for children who exist only in the spaces between official reality?" "I don't know. But I know this. If they're coming to Tommy in dreams, if I can remember children I never had, then we're not the only ones who can sense them." Eleanor turned back toward Margaret, her face set with determination. "There have to be others. Other parents, other families who have glimpsed these lost children." Margaret felt a flutter of hope in her chest, fragile as a butterfly wing, but real nonetheless. "You think we could find them? People willing to admit they've seen what cannot officially exist?" "I think we have to try. Because if we don't, you'll lose your position, and those children will lose their only advocate." Eleanor moved back toward the Margaret's desk, her movements sharp with purpose. "How long do we have? Deputy Rourke will be back tomorrow with parents. If I can't provide satisfactory answers, Sheriff Hartwick will use that as grounds for immediate dismissal. Then we have tonight." Eleanor's voice carried the same determination Margaret had heard in the voices of mothers defending their young. "Tonight to find proof that even skeptics cannot dismiss." Margaret looked down at her journal, its pages filled with 15 years of careful observations. The entries read like the ravings of a madwoman or the chronicles of something miraculous, depending on one's perspective. She had never imagined sharing them with anyone, had never dreamed of finding an ally in her peculiar vigil. "Eleanor," she said slowly, "if we do this, if we try to prove the existence of these children, there's no going back. We'll be marked as eccentric at best, insane at worst. Are you prepared for that?" Eleanor's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Miss Thorne, I've been marked as eccentric since I chose to work my own farm instead of remarrying after my husband died. A little more scandal won't hurt me, but losing the only teacher who truly sees my son, who truly sees all the children in her care, that would be a tragedy this town can't afford." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight coils of fear and shame that had constrained her for so many years. For the first time since Sheriff Hartwick's investigation began, she allowed herself to imagine fighting back instead of simply enduring. "What do you propose we do?" "We visit every family in town. We ask them about dreams, about memories of children who died young, about glimpses of small faces in empty rooms. And we document everything." Eleanor's eyes gleamed with purpose. "If these children exist in the spaces between life and death, then their families exist in those spaces too. We just have to help people remember." Margaret closed her journal and slipped it into her coat pocket. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Silent Lake, and she could smell rain in the wind. But for the first time in days, she felt something other than despair. "Where do we start?" "With the oldest families. The ones who have been burying children in this town for generations." Eleanor moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Thorne? Thank you for trusting me with this. I know it couldn't have been easy." Margaret followed her toward the door, turning to look back once at the classroom where invisible children waited patiently for someone to acknowledge their existence. On the blackboard, 3 names shimmered in chalk dust that glowed with its own light. David Chen, Emma Kowalski, Michael Santos. "Thank you for believing me," she said quietly. As they stepped out into the gathering storm, Margaret realized that everything would change after tonight. Either they would find proof that could save her career and validate her gift, or they would both be marked as delusional women whose testimony carried no weight in the rational world of official documentation. But for the first time in her adult life, she would not be facing that judgment alone. Thunder rolled across Silent Lake as the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Margaret and Eleanor reached the Chen family's small house on Maple Street, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air as they climbed the sagging porch steps. Margaret's hands shook as she raised her fist to knock, not from cold, but from the weight of what they were about to attempt. In her coat pocket, her secret journal pressed against her ribs like a guilty conscience. The door opened to reveal James Chen, a slight man whose family had run the town's only laundry for nearly 20 years. His dark eyes moved between Margaret and Eleanor with the wariness of someone accustomed to being the only Chinese face in a sea of suspicious New England farmers. "Miss Thorne," he said carefully. "Mrs. Brennan, is there some problem with the school?" Margaret felt Eleanor's encouraging presence beside her as she gathered courage for words that could destroy what remained of her reputation. "Mr. Chen, we're here to ask about your son, David." The change in James Chen's face was immediate and devastating. Color drained from his features, leaving him pale as winter ash. His hand tightened on the doorframe until his knuckles went white. "We have no son named David," he said, but his voice carried the hollow quality of a man reciting words he had been forced to memorize. "Mr. Chen," Eleanor said gently, "we know about the dreams." James Chen's breath caught audibly. Behind him, Margaret could see into the small, tidy house where a woman's voice called out in accented English, "James, who is at door?" "Please," Margaret whispered, "just 5 minutes. We need to understand what's happening to the children in this town." For a long moment, whilst Chen stood frozen in the doorway, clearly torn between the safety of denial and the dangerous territory of truth. Finally, he stepped back and gestured for them to enter. The Chen household was smaller than Margaret had expected, but immaculately clean and filled with the lingering scent of soap and pressed linen. Mrs. Chen emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was a tiny woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her dark eyes held the same warmth Margaret had often seen in David's face during her dreams of him. "This is my wife, Mei Lin," James said quietly. "Mei Lin, this is Miss Thorne from the school." Mei Lin Chen's face lit with recognition. "Ah, the teacher. David speaks of you so often in his—" Her words trailed off as she caught her husband's warning look, and the light faded from her eyes. "We have no David," she finished dully. Margaret felt her heart breaking for these parents who had been forced to deny their child's existence. She pulled her journal from her coat pocket, opening it to the pages where she had documented David's presence in her classroom. "October 10th, she read aloud. "David Chen struggled with reading comprehension but excelled at mathematics. Helped classmates understand fractions by drawing circles divided into parts." She looked up at Mei Lin Chen's face, seeing tears gathering in the older woman's eyes. "October 15th. David asked thoughtful questions about the Civil War, particularly interested in stories of divided families." "Stop," James Chen said sharply. "Please, stop." But Mei Lin had moved closer, her small hands reaching toward the journal as though it contained something precious. "You see him," she whispered. "You see our boy." "Mei Lin, no," James warned. "I will not be silent anymore." The small woman's voice carried a strength that seemed to fill the tiny room. "For 3 years we pretend. We say we have no son. We let them make us lie about our own child." Margaret exchanged a glance with Eleanor, sensing that they had stumbled into something much larger than attendance irregularities. 3 years?" she asked gently. Mei Lin Chen's face crumpled with grief, held too long in silence. "David was stillborn. Cord wrapped around neck. Doctor said brain never got air. Said he died before first breath." She pressed her hands to her chest. "But I felt him move after. I felt him trying to live." "The dreams started right after," James added reluctantly. "Dreams where David was alive, growing up, going to school. So real we could remember conversations with him, could remember teaching him to write his name. Sheriff Hartwick visited us last month," Mei Lin continued, her voice growing stronger. "Said teacher was making up children, putting false names in records. Said we must deny David exists or face questions about immigration papers, about right to stay in this country." The threat hung in the air like poison. Margaret understood now why the Chen family had been forced into denial. Their precarious position as the town's only Chinese residents made them vulnerable to official pressure in ways that other families were not. "But you still see him," Eleanor said. "In dreams." "Not just dreams," Mei Lin whispered. "Sometimes I find homework on kitchen table, arithmetic problems worked out in child's handwriting. Sometimes I hear his voice asking for help with spelling words." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. If Sheriff Hartwick had been visiting families, pressuring them to deny their lost children, then the conspiracy went deeper than she had imagined. "Mrs. Chen, have other families been visited? Other parents asked to deny children who appear in dreams?" James and Mei Lin exchanged a meaningful look. "The Kowalskis," James said finally. "Polish family on the other side of town. And the Santos family, they work at the sawmill." "Emma Kowalski and Michael Santos," Margaret breathed. "They're in my records too. All of us threatened," Mei Lin said bitterly. "All of us told to choose between acknowledging our children and keeping our places in this community." Eleanor's face had gone pale with understanding. "It's not about attendance records at all, is it? It's about something else entirely." Before anyone could answer, the sound of heavy boots on the porch steps froze them all in place. Through the thin curtains, Margaret could see the bulk of Sheriff Hartwick's form approaching the door, accompanied by two other figures she couldn't quite make out. "Back door," James Chen whispered urgently. "Quickly!" But it was too late. Hartwick's fist hammered against the front door with the authority of law behind it. "James Chen!" "Open up. Official business." Margaret felt panic rising in her throat. Being found here, with her journal full of documentation about the missing children, would be evidence of conspiracy or collusion in whatever deception Hartwick believed she was perpetrating. "Miss Thorne," Mei Lin whispered, pressing something small and hard into Margaret's hand. "David made this for you. In his dreams, he said his teacher would need proof." Margaret looked down to see a small wooden carving, roughly made but unmistakably the work of a child's hands. It was a tiny bird, its wings spread as though in flight, and carved into its base were the initials DC. "Chen, I know you're in there." Hartwick's voice carried the edge of violence barely controlled. James Chen straightened his shoulders and moved toward the door, his face settling into the mask of compliance that had kept his family safe for 20 years in a town that barely tolerated their presence. As his hand touched the door handle, he looked back at Margaret and Eleanor. "Whatever you're trying to do," he said quietly, "be careful. There are forces in this town that will destroy anyone who threatens their version of truth." The door opened to reveal Sheriff Hartwick flanked by Deputy Rourke and a third man Margaret didn't recognize. Tall, pale, dressed in the dark suit of an official from outside their small community. State investigator, she realized with growing dread. Hartwick's eyes swept the small room, taking in Margaret and Eleanor's presence with visible satisfaction. Well, Miss Thorne, making social calls, are we?" "Sheriff Hartwick," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Brennan and I were just what? Coaching witnesses? Coordinating stories?" Hartwick stepped into the room uninvited, his bulk making the small space feel claustrophobic. "This is State Investigator Morrison. He's here to look into allegations of fraud in our school system." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Margaret with clinical interest. "Miss Thorne, I understand you've been maintaining records for children who don't exist. That's a serious matter." Margaret felt the carved bird pressing against her palm, David Chen's gift from the realm between life and death. Around her, she could sense the desperate attention of parents who had been forced to deny their own children. And somewhere beyond the edges of normal sight, she felt the presence of the lost children themselves. "My records reflect the truth as I observe it," she said carefully. "Truth?" Hartwick laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The truth is that you're a disturbed woman who sees things that aren't there. The truth is that you've been falsifying official documents and wasting state resources on children who exist only in your imagination." "No," Mei-Lin Chen said suddenly, her small voice cutting through Hartwick's accusations like a blade. "The truth is that you force us to lie about our own children." The room went silent. Morrison's attention shifted to Mei-Lin with sharp interest, while Hartwick's face darkened with fury. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison said quietly, "what do you mean by that?" For a moment, Margaret thought the small woman would crumble under the weight of official attention, but Mei-Lin Chen had reached her breaking point, the place where silence became more unbearable than any consequence. "We had son named David. Born dead, but still real. Still our child. Sheriff forced us to deny him, threatened to question our right to stay in America if we say his name." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But teacher sees him. Teacher knows he real, even if he different kind of real." Morrison's pale eyes moved between Mei-Lin and Margaret, clearly trying to process what he was hearing. "Mrs. Chen, are you saying you have dreams about a deceased child?" "Not dreams, visits. David comes to learn, to be child he never got to be in life." The admission hung in the air like lightning, dangerous and illuminating. Margaret felt the world shifting around her, revealing the true scope of what was happening in their small Vermont town. Hartwick stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "That's enough. Mrs. Chen, you're clearly distraught. These fantasies about dead children are exactly the kind of delusions Miss Thorne has been encouraging." But Morrison raised a hand, stopping Hartwick's advance. "Actually, Sheriff, I'd like to hear more about these visits." Margaret realized that the state investigator was not the ally Hartwick had expected. Something in Morrison's manner suggested he had encountered similar cases before, that the existence of children who lived between life and death was not as impossible as Hartwick believed. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "if you're willing to listen, there are other families who have experienced similar phenomena." "Other families?" Morrison's interest sharpened. "How many?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady with determination. "Every family in this town that has lost a child young. They all dream of their lost ones, all find evidence of small presences in their homes. They've been threatened into silence, told to choose between acknowledging their children and keeping their places in this community." Morrison looked directly at Hartwick, his pale eyes cold as winter stone. "Sheriff, is this true? Have you been pressuring families to deny the existence of deceased children?" Hartwick's face had gone red with fury and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "These people are delusional. Dead children don't attend school. Dead children don't do homework. This is mass hysteria, nothing more." "Perhaps," Morrison said quietly. "But the systematic suppression of witness testimony is a serious matter, regardless of the nature of the phenomena being reported." Margaret felt hope fluttering in her chest, fragile but real. The state investigator was not dismissing their claims out of hand, was instead focusing on the more concrete issue of official intimidation and witness tampering. "Mr. Morrison," she said, pulling her journal from her coat pocket, "I have 15 years of documentation. Careful records of children who exist in ways that cannot be officially verified, but who are nonetheless real to those who can perceive them." Morrison extended his hand toward the journal. "May I?" As Margaret placed the leather-bound book in his pale fingers, she felt as though she were handing over 15 years of her life, all her secrets and observations laid bare for official judgment. The carved bird David Chen had given her seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, a reminder that some truths were worth the risk of destruction. Outside, thunder rumbled over Silent Lake, and Margaret could smell the electric scent of lightning in the air. The storm was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. State Investigator Morrison stood in the center of Margaret's classroom at dawn, her journal open in his pale hands as he read 15 years of carefully documented observations. The morning light slanted through frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across empty desks that somehow felt less empty than they had in weeks. Margaret watched his face for signs of skepticism or dismissal, but found only the clinical attention of a man accustomed to investigating phenomena that existed at the edges of official reality. "October 21st, 1958, Morrison read aloud. Lucy Whitmore present for arithmetic lesson, absent during recess. Parents report no living daughter named Lucy. Cemetery records show Lucy Whitmore, aged 7, died of influenza 1859. He looked up at Margaret. You've documented similar cases spanning more than a decade. Yes, Margaret said quietly. Behind Morrison, Sheriff Hartwick stood with his arms crossed, his face dark with barely contained fury. Deputy Rourke flanked the door like a guard, preventing any escape from this final confrontation. Morrison turned to another page. The patterns are consistent. Children who died young, often before completing their education, manifesting in classroom settings with clear educational goals. They appear to seek the learning experiences denied to them in life. This is insanity, Hartwick broke in. You're actually considering that dead children attend school? Morrison's pale eyes fixed on the sheriff with uncomfortable intensity. I'm considering that something unusual is happening in this community, and that your response has been to intimidate witnesses rather than investigate the phenomena they report. Margaret felt a flutter of hope, fragile as winter ice but real nonetheless. Morrison was not the ally Hartwick had expected, was instead proving to be someone with experience in cases that existed beyond the boundaries of normal investigation. Mr. Morrison, she said carefully, there's something else you should see. She moved toward the blackboard, where 3 names shimmered in chalk dust that seemed to glow with its own light. The letters pulsed like heartbeats, visible only when viewed peripherally, existing in the spaces between direct observation and absolute certainty. David Chen, Emma Kowalski, Michael Santos, she read. These names appear without my writing them, always in the same script, always accompanied by the same phosphorescent quality in the chalk. Morrison approached the blackboard, his head tilted as he examined the seemingly blank surface. Margaret held her breath, wondering if his particular type of sight would allow him to perceive what she saw so clearly. I see nothing unusual, he said finally. But that doesn't mean nothing is there. The admission sent a shock through the room. Hartwick's face went from red to pale, while Margaret felt validation flooding through her like warm light. You believe me, she whispered. I believe you're reporting accurately what you perceive. Whether that perception corresponds to objective reality is a separate question, but one that deserves investigation rather than suppression. Morrison closed her journal and handed it back to her. Miss Thorne, I've reviewed testimony from 12 families in this town. All report dreams or experiences involving deceased children. All were threatened with social or legal consequences if they discussed these experiences publicly. That pattern of intimidation is my primary concern. The primary concern, Hartwick said through gritted teeth, should be a teacher who's clearly suffering from delusions severe enough to affect her professional competency. Perhaps. But before we make that determination, I'd like to conduct a more thorough investigation. Morrison pulled a pocket watch from his vest, checking the time. The school day begins in 1 hour. I propose we observe Miss Thorne's classroom during normal operation. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. The thought of teaching while under direct observation by state officials was terrifying enough, but the possibility that the invisible children might manifest during the investigation added layers of complexity she could barely contemplate. What exactly are you looking for? She asked. Evidence. Anything that might explain the reported phenomena, whether psychological, sociological, or... Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. Or involving factors not typically acknowledged in official investigations. The careful phrasing suggested that Morrison had encountered cases like hers before, situations where reality proved more fluid than bureaucratic documentation typically allowed. Margaret felt a dangerous stirring of hope, the possibility that her 15 years of secret observation might finally be validated by official recognition. This is a waste of state resources, Hartwick protested. The woman is clearly delusional, and every minute spent entertaining her fantasies is time taken away from legitimate education. Sheriff, Morrison said quietly, your opposition to this investigation is noted. However, the decision has been made at levels above your authority. The rebuke was delivered so calmly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. Hartwick's face went through several shades of red before settling into a mask of barely controlled rage. Margaret realized that Morrison represented forces beyond the sheriff's local influence, agencies that operated with different priorities and protocols. "Very well," Hartwick said stiffly. "But when this investigation proves that Miss Thorne is unfit for her position, I expect immediate action. If the evidence supports that conclusion, appropriate measures will be taken." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Margaret with clinical interest. "Miss Thorne, do you have any concerns about proceeding with classroom observation?" Margaret thought of the children who existed in the spaces between certainty and denial, the lost souls who sought education in the only way available to them. If Morrison's investigation could somehow validate their existence, could provide official acknowledgement of their reality, then the risk was worth taking. "I have no concerns about my teaching methods or classroom management," she said carefully. "My only concern is for the children in my care." "All the children?" Morrison asked, and something in his tone suggested deeper meaning. "All the children," Margaret confirmed. At 8 o'clock, the school bell tolled across the October morning, its bronze voice carrying across frost-covered fields toward farmhouses where children bundled themselves into coats and scarves. Margaret stood at her desk, feeling exposed and vulnerable under the weight of official observation. Morrison had positioned himself in the back corner previously occupied by Sheriff Hartwick, his pale eyes missing nothing. Hartwick himself stood by the windows, his bulk radiating disapproval like heat from a stove. The children filed in with their usual morning chatter, but Margaret could sense their awareness of the adult tension that filled the room. Tommy Brennan caught her eye and offered an encouraging smile, while Sarah Mitchell looked nervous as she took her seat near the window. 32 young faces turned toward Margaret with the expectation of normalcy, despite the presence of observers who clearly represented something far from normal. "Good morning, class," Margaret said, summoning her teacher's voice from reserves of professional composure. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," came the chorus of young voices, familiar and comforting despite the circumstances. As she began the morning's lessons, Margaret felt the peculiar double consciousness that had marked her entire teaching career. Part of her attention focused on the visible children, part always aware of the presences that hovered at the edges of normal sight. Today, that peripheral awareness felt particularly acute, as though the official attention trained on her classroom had somehow amplified her ability to perceive what others could not. "Today we'll review yesterday's arithmetic problems," she announced, turning toward the blackboard. As she reached for chalk, her breath caught in her throat. There, written in letters that seemed to pulse with their own light, were the answers to homework problems she had not yet assigned. 17 plus 24 equals 41. 63 minus 18 equals 45. Margaret glanced back at Morrison, wondering if he could perceive the glowing script. His face remained impassive, but she noticed his pale eyes focused intently on the blackboard. "Miss Thorne?" Tommy Brennan's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Margaret realized she had been standing frozen, staring at the homework answers written by invisible hands. She forced herself to move, to begin the familiar routine of morning mathematics, despite the supernatural assistance that only she could see. "Let's begin with simple addition," she said, writing problems on the board. As she worked, she became aware of whispered voices offering encouragement to the visible children, ghostly tutors helping with difficult calculations. "Very good, Sarah," she heard herself saying as Sarah Mitchell worked through a subtraction problem. But even as she praised the visible child, Margaret was aware of another presence beside Sarah's desk, a translucent figure with yellow braids who pointed toward the correct numbers with fingers that cast no shadow. The morning progressed with surreal normalcy. Margaret taught reading and spelling, while invisible children read along, their voices creating a subtle harmony that only she could hear. Morrison observed everything with the focused attention of a scientist studying a new species, making occasional notes in a small leather book. During recess, as the visible children played outside under Deputy Rourke's watchful eye, Morrison approached Margaret's desk. "Interesting lesson," he said quietly. "You seem to respond to stimuli that aren't apparent to other observers." "I respond to all the children in my classroom," Margaret said carefully. How many children would you estimate are currently present in this room? Margaret looked around the empty classroom, her special sight revealing what it had always shown her. Children who existed in the spaces between life and death, lost souls seeking the education they had been denied. She could see David Chen at his usual desk, working diligently on arithmetic problems with the intense concentration she remembered from life. Emma Kowalski sat by the window, her yellow braids shining with ethereal light as she drew pictures of birds in margins only she could see. Michael Santos hummed softly while organizing pencils with the methodical care of a child who found comfort in order. 35, she said finally. 32 visible students, 3 others. Morrison made a note in his book. The 3 others correspond to the names in your attendance records? Yes. Can you describe them? Margaret looked at the invisible children who had become as real to her as any others she had taught. David Chen, age 8, dark hair, serious disposition. Excellent at mathematics, struggles with reading comprehension. Emma Kowalski, age 7, blonde braids, artistic temperament. Draws constantly, particularly birds and flowers. Michael Santos, age 9, cheerful personality, hums while working. All 3 display the curiosity and eagerness to learn that characterizes children their age. Morrison wrote steadily as she spoke, his pale eyes occasionally glancing toward the desks she described. Miss Thorne, in your professional opinion, are these children receiving educational benefit from their presence in your classroom? The question surprised her with its implications. Morrison was asking not whether the children existed, but whether their existence served a legitimate educational purpose. Absolutely, she said without hesitation. They participate in lessons, complete assignments, demonstrate learning progress. The fact that they cannot be documented through normal channels doesn't diminish their educational needs or achievements. And the visible children? Does the presence of these additional students affect their learning experience? Margaret thought of Tommy Brennan's improved arithmetic scores, of Sarah Mitchell's increased confidence in reading aloud, of the subtle ways that invisible tutoring had elevated the performance of her entire class. The visible children have shown remarkable improvement this year. Test scores are higher, classroom participation has increased, and behavioral problems have decreased significantly. Correlation or causation? In my professional judgment, the additional educational support provided by the invisible students has created a more effective learning environment for everyone. Morrison closed his notebook and looked directly at her. Miss Thorne, are you aware that similar phenomena have been reported in other rural schools across New England? Margaret's breath caught. Other schools? 17 documented cases in the past 5 years, all involving teachers who report the presence of deceased children seeking educational opportunities. All initially dismissed as delusion or fraud until more thorough investigation revealed patterns too consistent to explain as mass hysteria. The revelation struck Margaret like lightning. She was not alone, not the only teacher whose particular sight allowed her to perceive children who existed between life and death. Somewhere across New England, other educators struggled with the same impossible balance between official reality and the truth they witnessed daily. What happened to those other teachers? She asked quietly. Some were dismissed before investigation could be completed. Others were transferred to positions where their particular talents could be utilized more effectively. Morrison's pale eyes held depths she had not suspected. The state has certain specialized educational programs. Schools designed to serve students whose needs cannot be met through conventional channels. Margaret felt the world shifting around her, revealing possibilities she had never imagined. Schools for children who exist between life and death. Schools for children who require unconventional approaches to education, regardless of their ontological status. Morrison glanced toward the window where visible children played under autumn sunlight. The question is whether you would be interested in such a position. Before Margaret could respond, Sheriff Hartwick's voice cut across the classroom like a blade. Enough of this nonsense. Morrison, you can't seriously be considering legitimizing this woman's delusions. Morrison turned toward the sheriff with the cold patience of a man accustomed to dealing with local resistance to state authority. Sheriff Hartwick, your concerns are noted but not relevant to this investigation. Miss Thorne's qualifications and the phenomena she reports will be evaluated according to state protocols, not local prejudices. Local prejudices? Hartwick's voice rose with indignation. This is about basic sanity, about protecting children from a teacher who can't distinguish between reality and fantasy. Reality, Morrison said quietly, is more complex than local law enforcement typically acknowledges. The state's educational mission includes serving all children who can benefit from instruction, regardless of their particular circumstances. Margaret felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes as she realized what Morrison was offering. Not just validation of her gift, but a place where that gift could be used without shame or secrecy. The possibility of teaching openly, of acknowledging all her students regardless of their ontological status, was more than she had ever dared hope for. But as she looked around her familiar classroom, at desks worn smooth by generations of children, both visible and invisible, she felt the weight of leaving behind everything she had built in this small Vermont town. "What about my students here?" she asked. "The children who have found their way to this classroom." Morrison's smile was gentle. "Miss Thorne, children who exist between life and death are not bound by geographic limitations. Your students would follow their teacher wherever she might serve them most effectively." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Silent Lake, and Margaret could feel the electric touch of lightning in the air. Change was coming whether she was ready for it or not. The storm broke over Silent Lake at noon, sending sheets of rain against the schoolhouse windows as Margaret faced the choice that would define the rest of her life. State Investigator Morrison stood by her desk with official transfer papers that represented validation of everything she had seen and taught for 15 years. Sheriff Hartwick occupied the doorway like a sentinel, his face dark with the fury of a man watching his authority challenged by forces beyond his control. The visible children huddled at their desks, sensing the adult tension that crackled through the air like electricity. But Margaret's attention was divided between their worried faces and the invisible presences that filled the spaces between. David Chen, Emma Kowalski, Michael Santos, and others who had appeared throughout the morning as word spread through whatever realm the lost children inhabited. "The position at the Whitmore Institute begins immediately," Morrison said, his pale eyes holding depths of understanding that Margaret had never expected to find in official channels. "Specialized education for students whose needs cannot be met through conventional methods. Your particular talents would be invaluable there." Margaret looked down at the transfer papers, seeing her salvation written in bureaucratic language that somehow managed to acknowledge the impossible without explicitly naming it. After 23 years of hiding her gift, of maintaining careful silence about the children only she could see, she was being offered a place where that gift would be valued rather than feared. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Hartwick stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of local authority pushed to its breaking point. "If you refuse, you'll be dismissed from this position immediately. Falsifying attendance records, maintaining fraudulent documentation, encouraging mass delusion. These are serious charges that will follow you to any other teaching position you might seek." The threat hung in the air like smoke, but Margaret noticed that Morrison did not nod in agreement. Instead, the state investigator's expression remained carefully neutral, suggesting that Hartwick's interpretation of the situation was not necessarily definitive. "Sheriff Hartwick's concerns are noted," Morrison said diplomatically. "However, the final determination rests with state educational authorities, not local law enforcement." "Then, what is the state's position?" Margaret asked, feeling as though she stood at the edge of a precipice with salvation on one side and destruction on the other. Morrison opened his notebook, consulting notes he had made throughout the morning's observation. "The state recognizes that certain educators possess unusual sensitivity to phenomena that exist at the boundaries of conventional experience. Such individuals represent valuable resources that should be utilized appropriately rather than suppressed." The careful language was clearly designed to avoid explicit acknowledgement of supernatural phenomena while still validating Margaret's experiences. She realized that Morrison represented a bureaucratic evolution, a recognition that reality contained complexities that could not always be documented through traditional methods. "What about the children here?" Margaret gestured toward the visible students, then toward the spaces where invisible children waited with desperate attention. What happens to them if I leave? The visible children will receive conventional education from a replacement teacher. As for the others, Morrison's pale eyes moved across the seemingly empty spaces of the classroom. Children of their particular nature are not geographically bound. They follow educators who can serve their needs, regardless of location. Margaret felt something shift in the air around her, a sense of movement and anticipation from presences that had waited decades for acknowledgement. The invisible children were ready to follow her wherever her gift could be used most effectively. But Eleanor Brennan's voice cut through her contemplation like a bell. What about the families? The parents who have been forced to deny their children's existence? Margaret turned to see Eleanor standing in the schoolhouse doorway, rain-soaked and determined. Behind her stood James and Mei-Lin Chen, their faces showing the strain of 3 years spent pretending their son did not exist. Other figures gathered in the storm, Polish faces she recognized as the Kowalski family, Hispanic features that must belong to the Santos clan, the families who have been terrorized into silence. Eleanor continued, stepping fully into the classroom despite Hartwick's glowering presence. What happens to them when the only person who acknowledged their lost children disappears into some state program? Morrison's attention shifted to the gathering parents, his pale eyes noting their determination despite the official intimidation they had faced. The state's investigation has revealed systematic witness intimidation regarding reported phenomena. Such intimidation is illegal regardless of the nature of the phenomena being suppressed. Meaning what exactly? Eleanor demanded. Meaning that Sheriff Hartwick and his department will face review for their handling of this matter. Threatening citizens for reporting unusual experiences, regardless of their objective reality, constitutes abuse of authority. Hartwick's face went from red to pale as the implications struck home. You can't be serious. These people are delusional. They claim to see dead children. They report experiences that deserve investigation rather than suppression, Morrison corrected. The state's position is that all citizens have the right to discuss their experiences without fear of official retaliation. Margaret watched the confrontation with growing understanding. Morrison's investigation was about more than just her teaching methods, or even the existence of invisible children. It was about the right of citizens to report phenomena that existed outside official reality without facing persecution from local authorities. Miss Morrison, she said quietly, if I accept the position at Whitmore Institute, what becomes of this community? What happens to families who need someone who understands their experiences? Morrison consulted his notebook again, turning to pages she had not seen him write in. The state is prepared to establish a regional resource center for families experiencing similar phenomena, a place where such experiences can be discussed and documented without fear of official persecution. The offer was more than Margaret had dared hope for, not just validation of her gift, but institutional support for the families who had shared her burden of seeing beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. Mei-Lin Chen stepped forward, her small frame radiating determination. Miss Thorne, you gave David back to us. You saw him when everyone else said he didn't exist. If you can help other families like ours, then you must go where you can do the most good. Her words were echoed by murmurs of agreement from the other parents. Margaret realized that these families, who had suffered years of forced silence, were willing to let her go if it meant validation and support for others facing similar circumstances. Tommy Brennan raised his hand from his desk, his young face serious with the weight of adult concerns. Miss Thorne, will you still be our teacher? The question pierced Margaret's heart. These visible children had thrived under her care, had benefited from the invisible tutoring and support that existed in her classroom. Leaving them felt like abandonment, even if it meant serving a larger purpose. Tommy, she said gently, I'll always be your teacher in the ways that matter most. The things you've learned, the confidence you've gained, the curiosity you've developed, those are gifts you'll carry with you no matter where I go. She turned to face Morrison, feeling the weight of decision settling over her like a mantle. The Whitmore Institute, it serves children like David, Emma, and Michael, among others. Children whose educational needs cannot be met through conventional channels, regardless of their particular circumstances. Margaret looked around the familiar classroom one final time, seeing it through eyes that had learned to perceive layers of reality invisible to most observers. The visible children watched her with trust and affection despite their uncertainty about the future. The invisible children waited with desperate hope for acknowledgement that could free them from the limbo between life and death. "I accept the position," she said quietly. The words seemed to release something in the air, a collective sigh of relief from presences both visible and invisible. Margaret felt validation flooding through her like warm light. 15 years of secret observation finally recognized and valued. Hartwick's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "This is insanity. You're legitimizing mass delusion, encouraging people to believe in fantasies." "Sheriff," Morrison said with quiet authority, "your opinions on the matter are noted but irrelevant. The state has made its decision based on evidence and testimony gathered through proper investigation." "Evidence? What evidence?" "There is no evidence for dead children attending school." Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Hartwick with uncomfortable intensity. "There is extensive evidence of systematic witness intimidation, abuse of authority, and violation of citizens' constitutional rights. That evidence will be forwarded to appropriate state and federal agencies for review." The threat landed with devastating precision. Hartwick's face went through several shades of pale before settling into the gray of a man watching his career collapse around him. Margaret realized that Morrison's investigation had uncovered far more than supernatural phenomena. It had revealed corruption and abuse of power that would have consequences extending far beyond her classroom. "Mr. Morrison," Eleanor Brennan said, "the resource center you mentioned, when would it be established?" "Within 6 months. The state recognizes the need for institutional support for families experiencing phenomena that exist outside conventional documentation." Morrison glanced around the room, his pale eyes seeming to see more than they revealed. "Such experiences are more common than most people realize. It's time they received appropriate recognition and support." Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized the full scope of what was happening. Not only was her gift being validated, but institutional structures were being created to serve others who shared similar experiences. The isolation and secrecy that had defined her adult life were ending, replaced by recognition and purpose. As the storm outside began to subside, Margaret gathered her personal belongings from the desk she had occupied for 5 years. The familiar weight of her grade book, the smooth texture of well-used chalk, the faint scent of children and learning that permeated every schoolhouse. These physical anchors to her teaching life felt both precious and temporary. David Chen appeared beside her desk, his translucent form more solid than she had ever seen it. "Thank you," he whispered, his young voice carrying gratitude that seemed to echo from dimensions beyond normal perception. "Thank you for seeing us." Emma Kowalski and Michael Santos materialized beside him, their faces glowing with the joy of recognition finally achieved. Around them, other invisible children gathered. Lucy Whitmore from 1859, Timothy Morrison from 1903, Sarah Chen, who had died in the influenza pandemic of 1918. Decades of lost children who had found their way to Margaret's classroom because she alone had been willing to acknowledge their existence. "Will you come with me?" she asked them quietly, aware that the visible occupants of the room could not hear her side of the conversation. "Where you go, we go," David replied, his voice speaking for all the lost children who had found sanctuary in her care. "You are our teacher now and always." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the joy of purpose combining into something larger than she had ever experienced. She would leave Silent Lake, but she would take with her the children who needed her most, both visible and invisible, both documented and denied, all equally deserving of education and recognition. As Morrison led her toward the door, Margaret turned back one final time. The visible children watched her with faces showing sadness mixed with understanding beyond their years. The invisible children followed like a procession of hope, their translucent forms seeming to gain substance with each step toward acknowledged existence. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and electric with possibility. Margaret Thorne walked away from everything she had known toward a future where her gift would be valued rather than feared, where children who existed between life and death could learn without shame or secrecy. Behind them, in a classroom that suddenly felt empty despite its 32 remaining students, Sheriff Hartwick stood in the ruins of his authority, while parents who had been forced into silence began, for the first time in years, to speak openly about the children they had never stopped loving. The world had shifted, ever so slightly, toward acknowledgement of realities that existed beyond official documentation. And in that shift, both the living and the dead had found a measure of justice.